So welcome. I'm so excited. This is one of our first events doing something like this where we get to showcase our friends and hear from our colleagues about their experience. And my name is Chris Silvestri. I'm from Peace of Mind Yoga Counseling and Wellness Center. And we are a trauma-focused center that really highlights trauma-focused work and anti-racism. And for us, this is a huge deal for our community to be able to share with us their experiences so we can learn, because we're all in a space of growth. And so not only do we have a lot of work to do as a staff, but for us as a community, we want to give that opportunity to everybody else too. So I am so thankful for you all, really. You have no idea. So I am going to first introduce Stephanie Reed, and then she'll be able to introduce the rest of our panel. So all I ask is that you have an open heart and an open mind, and just think about the questions that are being posed, and then think about how this impacts other people. Listen and really let it sit with you. See what comes of it, and then we'll be able to ask some questions afterwards. So thank you all so much.
All right, so thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you to Chris and the Peace of Mind team for hosting this crucial conversation and for entrusting this esteemed panel to lead this conversation. This event is a testament to the center's commitment and evolution to doing this work around racial justice. I'm excited to be here, as I'm sure all the panelists are, and you'll hear that this evening. There's so much work to be done around dismantling racism in America, including Berkeley Heights and the surrounding communities. So thank you all for showing up tonight. So just to give you a quick update on the format, we have a few questions. The panelists will answer some of the questions. As Chris mentioned, we'll open it up for Q&A. Some of us may be staying behind afterwards, so if you want to continue the conversation, then we'll be able to do that. So I am going to start from my left and ask each panelist to introduce themselves and say why it's important for you to be a part of this conversation today.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Brianna Sainvil. I am an educator, a business owner, and a mother of 5. So, yes.
So I think in all of my avenues, it's important to have these conversations. One, as a mother raising Black children in this country, as somebody in education and in the dance community, I think addressing racism and white supremacy in these spaces is super important for just being able to shatter the glass and hold people accountable and address real and effective change for this community. And I think I want to help to sustain a world where my children can walk and not be looked at and not be shamed and just live in freedom the way that so many others do on a regular basis.
How's everybody doing? My name is Trevor Cromwell. I've been for the past 14 years done a lot of work in the community. Many people know me from my role here at the Y as the Director for Teens and Equity, so working with the youth, working on our Y's equity strategy. I also do a lot of work in the community with different nonprofit organizations, committees, parent groups. I guess I can go on forever in terms of why this is important to me. I'll just say that as a Black man that grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, I understand the challenges that come with that outside of, just the history of what racism has affected me, people who look like me. And I think, people try to, when it comes to race and what it looks like in 2024, try to sugarcoat it. But the fact that the system that was created centuries ago still is affecting us in different ways today always, is a good enough reason to try to make sure tomorrow's generation has it easier than today's. So I think that's a quick, simple way to summarize what I do.
Hello, my name is Morghan Blair. I'm currently a sophomore at Morgan State University, political science major. And I've been trying to bring like two racial justice issues since I was 8, unfortunately. And I think it's important because when you grow up in an area that does not look like you, it is hard to try to find who you are in your culture and try not to assimilate with everybody else. And when your culture is constantly becoming demonized by a group of little 3rd graders and 4th graders, it does make it hostile, but having conversations like this can always help the next generation, also help heal your inner child as well. So I think this is very important.
Hi, my name is Ayana Joseph, and these conversations and the discussion about racism is an ongoing conversation that has to be had. There's no choice about it. As long as we coexist, we always need to have this conversation. I think at this point in time, there's a need to get past the stigmas and the uncomfortability. And I think that's like one of the biggest challenges we face just as Americans, is this level of like, I don't want to be, I don't want to be uncomfortable having these conversations. Like everyone here, as an African American person in this community, it's so very important for just the safety and the survival of, African Americans.
And my why for being here tonight is because I think we have been conditioned as a society to have these conversations sort of with people that we know, people who we're familiar with, people who we feel safe with, but those also tend to be people who look like us and people who think like us, and the conversations need to be public and the groups need to be expanded, and you are a part of that this evening, and so with that we can get started. All right. So our first question, I'm going to leave this open for any of the panelists to answer. Can you share examples of how racism manifests in everyday life in Black and BIPOC communities, and what impact does that have on mental health? I know. Let's go.
I could start. That's a very complex question, but I think the best way I could put it is that it adds paranoia to my everyday life almost. I remember when Trayvon Martin happened, and my mom, obviously I'm not a Black man, and my mom was not too worried about that, but it was a sort of a caution around, don't wear a hood, and then if you see a police officer, make sure you say hi and try to be kind. And then when all that stuff happens and you see other people do that and it still doesn't work, so more sort of always being hyper vigilant. And even now I go to an HBCU and I'm still, when I go off campus in white areas, I still am hyper vigilant. I still look over my shoulder, and police officers make me a little bit nervous, even though they look like me, because of what happened in Minneapolis. They were Black officers. So I think it's just an added sense of paranoia to my everyday life. And on top of that, I'm a woman on top of that. So it's like the paranoia every woman has, you don't walk alone, don't walk at night, but then also I'm Black. So then those two layers of paranoia just clashing with each other. And then mental health, I think it just makes me just not want to leave my house sometimes. I don't want to leave my dorm. I just want to go to class, go back, and watch Disney Plus all day, and just not interact with anybody. But I know I can't live like that. I know I have to go outside. I have to keep going. So
you keep your mask on, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest things. So whether you're working in corporate or you're a parent in a certain neighborhood and community, and you have to go to a parent-teacher conference, or you have to you always are on guard. And I remember when I first moved here, I was at the supermarket with my kids, and I have 4 daughters, and I'm there, and they're like picking out stuff, and this lady comes up to me and she says to me, she was like, do they all have the same dad? Not hello, not how you doing, or anything like that. That was the first thing that came out of her mouth was, do they all have the same dad? And I think she followed up with, what did she say? And she's like, oh, and you remind me of like my mate or something like that. And I'm just like, in front of my kids. So I tell that little story just to kind of give you an idea of like what it is day to day. Like you come out of your car when you're getting ready to go to the school, or you're getting ready to go to work, and you don't know what you're going to deal with. You don't know who's going to, say something to try to trigger you or get you upset. So you start off your day with that armor of like defense, like no matter what, I got to be ready for what's going to come at me. And then you got to teach your kids to be ready for that. So, it's tough when you, like, to your point, like your parents probably like told you, don't wear a hood. Make sure they see you. You make sure, like when we moved here, we made it our duty to go to the police station in Berkeley Heights so they knew. Mm-hmm. Because every time my husband would host a poker game and his friends would come from other towns, they would get stopped at Mountainside every time. So I was like, you know what, Jim, you probably need to go in and let them know who you are so this doesn't happen. So it's like we have to do all these things just to try to, make a space. And it's taxing and it's tiring and it is draining and it does mess with your mental. And I have to check in with my kids and have those conversations. Like, is everything okay? So.
Yeah, I think, so I agree with everything that was said so far. I think an interesting metaphor to describe racism in 2024 is, you probably use a lot, but one that I think would resonate with me is it's like running a race with invisible hurdles, right? Because it's not as blatant as a whites only sign these days, but we understand that it still exists and it can hit you at any moment. And the likeliness of somebody that doesn't look like you not being able to understand it because they don't see it definitely can be taxing and can be stressful. And I think to Ayana's point, you have to be conscious that there's an extra few steps we have to take for everything. And there is a certain level of anxiety that comes with that. I remember growing up and having family members talk about, job applications, saying they don't put African American on the job application because we understand, biases that come with certain things like getting certain jobs. So it's always being on guard. I think that adds a level of stress and anxiety, and a lot of times, especially when you're young, trying to process this, not understanding that this isn't fair, understanding that a lot of people in leadership positions or who should be looking out for you don't, that could lead to anger, that could lead to frustration, that could lead to fear, that can just lead to so many different things. So yeah, it's definitely taxing and it's definitely stressful, and just knowing you always have to take those extra steps. It's like normal once you get to a certain point, it's almost normal, but that doesn't mean that it's right. So that's what I think it looks like today.
I think for me, the word is exhausting. The word is exhausting, and I think I also grew up starting in a predominantly African-American community, and I wasn't aware of my Blackness until I moved into Scotch Plains. And then I became a minority in my community. And having an older brother who we didn't have to have these conversations before, but now my parents had to have conversations with them about him getting pulled over every time he drove through Clark, every time he drove through Cranford, every time he drove through Westfield. And then even now, my parents still live in Scotch Plains. And if my husband and I drive separate cars, I have to make sure that I'm behind him because he gets pulled over every single time. And I have to stop and wait with him because I'm not going to keep driving. And I think having these conversations and even then talking to our children about like, well, why does this happen every single time? What is he doing wrong? And my son is 6, and it's like, I don't know how many other communities have to have these conversations, and we can't afford not to have these conversations. I can't afford not to tell my son that when you go outside, not to put your hood up, or making sure that you're polite. You can't lash out the way that other people lash out. And I think even with me being in a corporate space, when I'm angry, I can't show it because then I become the angry Black woman at work. And I think taking those extra precautions, those extra steps, takes a toll. And I think as a parent, I have almost been something that I'm working on, but I think something that I've noticed is that in doing so, I've conditioned my children to live in a space where they can't be as free as they want to be. Where I can't let my son be too loud. I can't let him he can't have the meltdown. He can't have the tantrum in the grocery store, right? Oh God, this is the first question. It's hard. It's hard. And I think now, even in a space where he's started having, like, he's at an age where he has sports, where he's like, well, why am I the only one that looks like this and nobody else looks like me? You know, and I think that's a hard conversation to have with a 6-year-old. It's a difficult conversation to have. It's a conversation that I didn't think that we would have to have so soon, but it takes a toll and it's exhausting. I think every night I have to do a check-in with them, but also a check-in with myself, that I have to make sure that I'm not allowing what's happening outside to pour into how I want to raise my children.
Thank you. So a few examples that I'll share about my experience have been, one actually just happened about a month ago, and it was being the only Black person, the only person of color in a corporate training event, and also being the only person not asked to share when it was time for feedback. And walking out of the session feeling like, so you let me know everything I needed to know about this. And it was about organizational culture. It is also having a team that I have direct responsibility for, and having my counsel ignored and having my authority usurped by someone who has nowhere near as much experience, does not have the credentials that I have, and certainly doesn't have responsibility for my team's performance or their deliverables, but the organization allowed it to happen. To Brianna's point, I have a 20-year-old son who, when he was searching for a college to attend, we did a college visit in rural Pennsylvania. He wanted to go on his own. I implored him not to, so I followed him. And on the way back, I said, make sure you drive at the speed limit. We cannot do this. We can't do this here. And he was about 5 miles over the speed limit. He got pulled over. I waited behind him. And when I tell you, my heart was in my throat because, right, I couldn't approach the car. I couldn't be anywhere near it. I wasn't on the phone. All I had was the visual from my windshield. And I was panic stricken, right? I'm panic stricken. I live just the next township over. I'm panic stricken when I leave here to go home and vice versa, depending on where I am, the time of day. But I was absolutely panic stricken, not just for myself, but specifically for him, because as a mother, to know that there's nothing that I can do to protect him in a situation like that, regardless of how many conversations we've had, there's literally nothing that I could do. I couldn't wait to drive the 3 hours and get back home and finally exhale. The toll that takes is, right, it's the exhaustion, it's the anxiety, it's the paranoia. It is, from a professional perspective, the feelings of imposter syndrome, when I know I am fully capable of doing the work that I've been hired to do in every role that I have, but have people who treat me in a way that makes me question my own credibility. And I was at an event last night and ran into 2 women, one Black and one BIPOC woman, and without prompting, each said, we all left a toxic situation, and each said that they still are traumatized and currently are in therapy as a result of being in those environments, because the isms and the phobias were strong, and it contributed to our departures, our individual departures. Yeah. So yes, we all did start kind of heavily with this. I won't apologize for it, but I do think that, right, these are conversations that need to happen. So our next question. Yeah. So our next question, I'm going to start with Brianna. What role does implicit bias among educators and administrators play in perpetrating racial disparities in academic achievement and behavior management? And how can schools foster accountability to dismantle these biases?
I think one of the things that I can think of immediately is when we talk about these Black communities, these school districts, and where you have teachers coming in that aren't a part of this community, going into this community with this savior complex, as if they have to go in and fix something, and I want to put that out there, that there's nothing to fix because we are not broken. And I think it's important to understand that if you're coming into these communities to teach, to be an administrator, that you need to come in as a student first. You need to come in with the understanding that you need to learn the children, you need to learn the community. In simple words, you need to come correct. Like, really, because I think when you come in with this bias that, you have something more to offer as opposed to the children having something to bring to the table, the children have something that's worth learning about, we then do away with these deficit narratives as if their lack of success or their lack of academic achievement is something that they caused. Because of their low income is why they can't succeed. Because of fatherlessness is why there's no discipline, as opposed to looking at the systems that put them there in the first place, such as redlining, such as what discriminating with hair, and how there's a lack of I think, tolerance and understanding for hair texture and protective hairstyles, and how children have been stopped from walking graduation, attending prom, because of what their hair looks like. And I think we start to police children way too early. So what I think needs to happen is there has to be and teachers need to check themselves before they come into spaces. I think administrators need to check themselves before they come into spaces. Look at the policies that have been put into place and question them. Just because something has been in place for years doesn't mean that it's what's right. I work in a Montessori environment, and something as simple as one of the things that we tell children when they're working or when they're watching another child's work is to put their hands behind their back. And when I started in this environment, I kept hearing teachers say, put your hands behind your back, put your hands behind your back. And it did not sit well with me. One, hearing it be told to my children for the first time. I have 4 boys and 1 girl. And I went to leadership and I was like, I'm coming in as an administrator, and I'm telling you that the language that we're using here, and my school is one of the very few schools that educate Black and brown children in a Montessori space. And it was, well, that's the way it's always been. That's the language that we've always used. And I was like, do you know why? Do you know why this is not okay? Do you know why this language, whether we used it in the 1800s, whether we used it in the 1900s when this educational philosophy was formed, do we know why in 2024, why this is problematic? And nobody understood why. And I was like, okay, well, as for me in my house, as for me in my school, this is what's gonna happen. And there was a lot of pushback, and there was a lot of like, okay, well, you're trying to stir up problems where there aren't any. So I think making sure that we're looking at policies. We're looking at rules and why they're put into place, and who stands to lose the most from it. What are our predispositions? What are the motives of why we're putting rules into place, and dismantling them from there? And I think starting to pull things down brick by brick and really just analyzing them and causing them to think critically, I think is the most important thing. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Ayana, as a parent, can you respond to the question?
Yes, so as a parent and someone who's been actively involved in schools and continuously involved in schools, I know that I've had to advocate and fight for my kids. I remember my oldest one, when she first started school, there was an incident with a teacher where it was like an art class, and she was drawing something, and the teacher was like, no, you need to use the dark, whatever things they were using. And this is like a 10-year-old. She's like, I just want to draw what I want to, I want to use the colors that I want to. And then it's just the insensitivity that, some administrators or educators have when it comes to dealing with children of color. Sometimes it's just a little troubling. It's, having your children sometimes in these school systems, you do it strictly, I can speak for myself, in a sense of like, oh, well, this is a smaller environment and they have more resources, this is what you tell yourself. But in the same breath, you do all this and then your child graduates and they just say, I don't ever want to come back here again. And then they start to unload and they tell you all these things that they went through. And a lot of it is the inaction by some teachers and administrators. So it's the inaction, it's doing nothing and pacifying it because they just want to skirt along. And then you have your children that get to a point where they just shut down. Their confidence is gone, their self-esteem, because they're up against people that are not supporting them, and then they have to deal with some of their peers who don't, who want to, bully or be negative. So, if I didn't be as proactive as I tried to be, it would probably have been a lot worse. But my advice to some teachers and educators, I would say, even in these communities, it's important to have educators and leadership that look like me, so that children that don't look like me see leadership at every level. True story. So my one daughter, she swims for the Summit Area Y, and she's swam here since she's 8 years old. So she's done, this is her 10th year. She started out as the only Black girl on the team, which says a lot, and it has such a, it sends chills to you when you think about it on bigger picture. And in between that time, there were people that, we had some people come in and out. But I say that to say that it's important for these spaces to also try to promote and bring that, encourage people of color to be in that space as well. And I know, like, with her being here, she got the support she needed. I will say her coach, the current coach that she has, he also made an effort in terms of bringing in people, because he and I went back and forth, and we've had these great conversations and open conversations. That's why I love the Y. And he even said, I hear you, Mrs. Joseph, but I think it's important for us to also have coaches that look like Nia and look like some of the kids here. Representation goes both ways. It's not just, okay, your daughter is the only one, but we need to also have leadership so that all kids see what leadership look like, and it's not always a white face. It's faces of many facets and many colors. So.
Thank you. Morghan, in academia, do you have a perspective to share?
All right, so school, K through 12 is interesting whenever I think about it, because I grew up in Springfield, New Jersey, and it's very white. When I first moved in, it was a 0.08% black population, and unfortunately, my family and one other black family made up that population together. And it wasn't, I didn't notice anything different until 3rd grade. Then that's when, you know, you start learning about slavery, learning about black history, and everyone's looking at you to answer these questions, and I'm like, I'm in 3rd grade. I don't know a lot about it. But one thing that sticks out to me is I have a younger sister. She's 2 years younger than me. And I thank God every day that she didn't have to go through everything racially that I went through. Of course, we all had our issues and problems in school, but when it came on the racial front, it's like it hit me first, and then by the time she came through, it was like, okay, we don't want to do it again. But she was in 3rd grade, I was in 5th. I was already struggling with my teacher. She kept saying I had behavioral issues, using this broad term of, oh, you have behavioral issues, and we had a behavior chart. And every day I would always start at purple, always end up at blue. And I'm very anal about that, so I was like, what do I keep doing to get to this color? And it even got to a point where my parents were like, don't worry about it, like, it's fine. I was like, no, what is it? So my sister had an issue in class, and they pulled me out of class to try to calm her down. And I'm thinking, oh, asthma attack, she's panicking. Her teacher said, where are you from? And she said, I'm from the United States. He said, no, where are you really from? Like, where in Africa are you from? And she kept saying the United States, the United States. I'm not from Africa, I'm from the United States. So they called me out of class to tell her where she was from. I said, we're from New Jersey in the United States. Then they said, oh, you don't know where you're from either. I'm gonna tell your dad. So then from being outside of class, that my teacher then gave me a blue card again because I was outside of class because another teacher had called me out to deal with this nonsense. So now I'm upset because I'm on blue again and I should be at purple. My sister's upset because no one believes they're from the United States. And now my dad's upset because he receives this email saying that your kids don't know where they're from. So, and that always rings in my mind because it was something as minuscule almost as that compared to all the other things that have happened to me in middle school and high school and just, you know, being black in America, all that small moment only because an educator who went to college and who went through the public school system decided that he's gonna ask a 3rd grader and a 5th grader, where are you really from? Even though you know we're African Americans, you know about slavery, you know about all of these things. You know I can't tell you, I honestly cannot trace back where my people started before slavery started in 1619. I cannot tell you. Yet you still keep trying to get it out of me, knowing that, and she's crying. She's full-blown tears because you're yelling at her and you're making her feel like she did something wrong. I'm only in 5th grade and I'm like, this is my little sister, you're making her upset, and now you're calling me out of class. And I'm already dealing with another teacher. So when it comes to, and that's on the behavioral side, and then of course it adds, I think some, at least in Springfield I can say, some teachers, they talk to each other. So when I went to 6th grade, it carried, oh, she has behavioral problems. And now I'm in 7th grade, oh, she has behavioral problems. And it kept, every teacher kept looking at me like, oh yeah, your grades are great, but you have behavioral issues. And I was like, I've never been in trouble a day in my life. I didn't even go to timeout when I was a kid at home. Like, my parents never had to take away a laptop or a phone from me. I don't have a phone yet. So I'm like, all these impressions of me. So then I get into high school, 9th grade English teacher is like, oh, you have behavioral issues. You're being unruly in class. Your hair's a distraction. She called my father in the middle of class. Class is going on. We're learning about something like the Scottsboro Boys syphilis experiment. And she said something wrong, and I said, that's not the right information. She said, what do you mean? I said, the dogs weren't crowd control, they were to attack black people. That wasn't just, you know, like, oh, security at a concert. And everyone left to know I'm serious. Like, she's saying the wrong information. She said, you're being disruptive, I'm gonna call your dad. I was like, okay, you can call him, but I'm not wrong. And I'm like my father, I don't really have that much of a filter. So she emailed him in class, and again, she has a behavioral issue. My dad called her during class the next day and basically, in nicest terms, said, my daughter doesn't have any issues. You're not giving the right information. And you're supposed to be reading Pride and Prejudice, but yeah, we're talking about this. What is your goal here? Let me see your lesson plans. And then from that point on, then of course COVID happened, so it was a lot easier to navigate, but it was very rough. K through 12, and just like what you had said, when I come home for break, to be quite honest, I dread coming back to Springfield. I dread going home sometimes because it's not like I don't have pleasant memories of being in K through 12. Like when it was time to graduate, everyone's like, oh my gosh, I remember being at, elementary school, and I'm like, I don't have those same memories you have. I don't have those memories. Of course, I have, two of my closest friends, and all of us are people of color, and all of our experiences are the same in a semblance. Like none of us have happy memories from being in high school or middle school, and it's upsetting because when I talk to my sister, she has wonderful memories, and I love that for her, and it's wonderful. But then it's also like, dang, I don't have any of those happy memories. So it is difficult, and it is very exhausting. But I will say I'm glad that I had my parents to sort of help me keep that confidence up a little bit. It was a struggle at times, and now I'm trying to rebuild it going to an HBCU. But I'm glad my parents did instill in me, like, I understand what they're saying, but when you come to this house, you don't have educational problems, you don't have behavioral issues, you're fine the way you are. Who cares about a blue card? It's fine. So, yeah, I'm glad I had the support system that I had.
You stay purple.
Yes, yes. It's funny, Morgan, because my oldest daughter is here, and everything that you said, we looked at each other, we locked eyes, and that's her experience. Like, you had to lead the way so that your siblings can have it just a little bit easier. They have their own adversities, but you had to be the one. You had to be that girl. You had to be the one on the bus telling them, look, I don't want you using the N-word. I don't use the N-word, so you shouldn't use the N-word. But you're different. No, I'm black. I just don't talk like that. And not everybody talks like that. These are the things that you went through. And it breaks my heart because everything that you're saying, like, I remember my oldest daughter, and she can tell you, she's right there in the audience. It's like kind of like everything. That's why my eyes are like, oh my God. It's like the same thing.
I have a question. That's okay?
It is.
Yeah.
Ms. Morgan, just curious, you grew up in Springfield, which is mostly white.
Yes.
I'm from Newark Hillside area, and I live out in this area now.
Oh, I started in Hillside. Okay.
I'm sorry, you really?
I started in Hillside
Okay,
first.
okay. I have a lot of stories with that too. Ms. Morgan, my question is, if you grew up and went to like a black, like whatever, Newark or Hillside, if you went through the school system there, you think it would have been easier for you? And do you think you'd be the same person you are today?
That's a good question. I think it would have been easier culturally. I would have been able to, if I went to where my natural heritage school, it would have been way easier. But I do think academically might have been a little difficult because of the resources that are given to those schools. I started at Hillside, and we moved because of the academic resources. Me and my sister were testing out of our classes, and our teachers could not keep up with our reading levels. It wasn't anything, like genius level, but it was, where I was in first grade, and I was reading a little bit higher, and they couldn't keep up. So we did move. So I think academically, I would not be the same person. But culturally, I think it would have been a whole lot easier to navigate some of the issues that I did face in Springfield.
Can I chime in for a minute from the parent perspective? Because I think your parents had the same kind of thought process we did. So we were in West Orange prior to us moving to Berkeley Heights. And I was sharing this with Trevor as well earlier. So for us, it was kind of the same thing. We were like, we can't afford to put them in private school. And there's nothing wrong with the education system in West Orange. We just knew for ourselves at that time what we were trying to do with our kids. So we looked at us towns, and we looked at, okay, well, this is a small setting. They have XYZ resources. So in that regard, you'll be set. I will tell you, to your point, and I think you're living that life right now as someone who attends at HBCU, it is it's completely night and day. Mm-hmm. You get the benefits of the resources of growing up in this community, and you have access to certain things, but you lose a part of yourself. And as a parent, I'm at home trying to nurture that for my daughters, and I try to be that example for them because they don't see it in school. They don't have that representation. They're just like, here, you go here, and you just have to keep your head down, and you take advantage of the school resources and hope for the best. If you assimilate, we did a good job. If not, I got to figure out how I'm going to do some therapy and get you going. And I'll tell you, I struggle with that. Because my heart was in the right place. And I have no regrets. but I do see the difference. So like I have 2 other girls that are in high school and they go to the county schools. And it's funny, the one that's a sophomore, when she got in, she was like, oh my God, I finally get to wear my hair in like a crow puff and I don't have to worry about somebody saying I have broccoli hair. I finally get to be myself. So as excited as I was for her to have that opportunity, it broke my heart a little bit because I'm like, damn, all these years they have to try to straighten their hair and do all these things because they want to assimilate, they want to fit in. And, as parents, you want to give your kids the best opportunity you can with what you have. So it's like you struggle with that. You play this game where you're like, all right, hope for the best. On the weekends, we'll try to, go back to Brooklyn or go visit our family and give you that space. But it's you got to choose your battle. You got to choose your situation.
So just before moving on to the next question, I do just want to add commentary here around so I grew up in Newark. I grew up in Newark in an all Black and Latinx community. And by the time I was in high school, I was taking a school bus to a local Catholic all girls high school and found myself in college at a predominantly white institution making very intentional decisions to be in Black spaces. I made a critical decision to live in the Paul Robeson Living Learning Community at Rutgers University because it was so important to me to get back to a space where I felt like I could be safe, where I could learn, where I could come home, literally come home and be around people who were going to support me after dealing with what I needed to deal with on campus to get my education. And I'm speaking for myself, but would think that the same is true for the panel and for others in the room, that it has to be a very deliberate move each and every day to find spaces that are free, or at least freer from racism and its effects, because you can hear how detrimental it is to wake up every day knowing that this is what we have to deal with, this is what we need to live with, and figuring out, so how do I survive, how do I even thrive in these types of environments. So while we are on, I want to keep an eye on the time. I want to get into, while we're still talking about systemic issues, issues like redlining and mass incarceration and discriminatory lending practices, and how these intersect and exacerbate racial disparities with homelessness and what can be done to dismantle these interconnected systems. So Trevor, if you would weigh in on that.
Yeah, I guess I promise you I'm not a big history person or a numbers person, but as I mentioned earlier, I don't think we got to where we are today because of what happened last year, 2 years ago, or 10 years ago. I think, where we started played a role in everything, right? So, and I promise I'll get to the question, but, when you think about slavery and when slavery was abolished, essentially slaves were free, but they weren't promised housing. They weren't promised food. They weren't promised clothes, right? In the civil rights era, it became illegal to, say you're only hiring white people, but that doesn't mean that people still didn't have their personal biases or stereotypes. And so I say all that to say that if you look at today, we're talking about mass incarceration with police. Even then, once slavery ended and, Black people who were free needed food, needed clothes, it's around that time a lot of policing agencies were created, ironically, right? So you still see a lot of these issues and a lot of these disparities today. It's because of, it's passed down through generations. So if you're looking at something like housing, even today, I think a Black person is 3, maybe probably more than that, 3 to 4 times more likely to be denied than the average white person or something like that. If you're looking at healthcare disparities, Black mothers are more likely to die at childbirth, like 3 times. These are all things. This didn't happen within the last few years. These are all systemic. So what happened decades ago, what happened centuries ago, still plays a real fact in what happens today. I think the easy answer for all of that is obviously housing policy reform, criminal justice reform, financial equity initiatives. That's probably the easiest answer. If you're getting, if you say, well, what could be done about it? But I think, what I talk about amongst my groups, and what I think is important, especially for Black people today, is just owning your own. Mm-hmm. And I think being an example, and I know we're going to talk about, the roles of community later on, so we'll dive a bit more into that. But when it comes to housing, if you own your own, you're not going to discriminate. You're not going to make it difficult for people of different colors to rent with you. In terms of healthcare, right? Because I know that's a big one. Going to a Black doctor, having more Black doctors. Again, there's anxiety or there's paranoia a lot of times in the Black community with healthcare system. And again, it's because of what happened before. You can point to, the Tuskegee experiments, and a lot of people look at that and say, well, that happened a long time ago. It lasted from the 30s to the 70s, which really isn't that long ago. If you look at the timeline of U.S. history, Black people have only had civil rights for about 20% of its history. So all these things that happened that started these systems that were set up were never truly dismantled. They were never truly corrected. And so we're directly dealing with a lot of these things today. So building your own, owning your own, being involved from the ground up is important, especially on a local level. Again, I'm not a big political guy, but I do know that things locally are more likely to affect you than on a grander level. I think we always look for some leader that can galvanize all the people and make this big change. And I think history shows us that doesn't change a lot often. And so just banding together with people of the same mindset that are ready to do the work on the ground level to really enforce some of these changes, and owning your own and building your own, I think is important.
Thank you for that. So if I can just share a couple of statistics that I came across while preparing for this. So to Trevor's point around enslaved people not having any resources when emancipated. In 2021, Edelman, which is a global public relations organization, annually they do a trust barometer, and it typically is about the financial sector, but in 2021 they had a specific report on racism in financial systems in the U.S. One critical statistic is the impact on wealth transfer. The wealth of a typical white family is 8 times higher as compared to Black families, and that is information from the Survey of Consumer Finances, right? That does not happen overnight. That does not happen by circumstance, right? It's not coincidence. It happens because of generational wealth, which Black families and BIPOC families are at an enormous disadvantage because we did not have resources that were given to us that we were, whether it was homes, tangible assets, money, access to information, access to education, everything that we've talked about this evening truly goes back to enslavement and even before then. And because as a country, we are not prepared to have deep conversations that are resolution oriented, we are going to continue to, unfortunately, have to have conversations like this where we uncover truths for people who, for them, this information is very new, where for others of us, we've been dealing with it for decades, right? One other statistic is in that same survey, there were 4 categories of negative experiences that people with high income, so these are people who made $100,000 or more, perceived when dealing with financial institutions. And in all 4 categories, so the people ethnically were white, Black, Latinx, and Asian. In every single category, Black people unfortunately came out on top in terms of feeling exploited, being given higher rates of fees because of the color of my skin, being mistrusted. And that was evidenced by having to supply more proof of employment than I thought was necessary. being condescension, so having an employee talk down to me, and feeling unseen, feeling like there was no one that cared about me and that cared to know me as a person. Again, back to Trevor's point, building our own, creating our own, and being seen by people who look like us, because they too, in all likelihood, have experienced what we are experiencing and wanted to be in a position to see and to uplift others. So I will move on. I think we have time, hopefully, for another 2 questions. I think Trevor mentioned just a moment ago healthcare disparities. I do want us to touch on that briefly. So in what ways do historical and structural inequities shape present-day healthcare disparities for marginalized racial groups? And how can we move beyond surface-level reforms to truly achieve health equity? Ayana or Brianna, if either of you would like to chime in.
I can go.
Okay.
So a quick context. Once I found out that I was pregnant, I was getting ready for labor, and my cousin who had delivered before me had mentioned, like, when you go into labor, if you notice that you're in any pain, be sure to exasperate your pain, like exaggerate your symptoms. And I asked her why, and she was like, because she had a doctor tell her that when she was in pain, well, Black women can take more. So when we tell them that we're in pain, there's no sense of urgency. There's no immediate response. So, and I was somebody, just out of personal preference, I didn't want an epidural. I wanted to have as much autonomy over my body as I could possibly have in labor. And she was like, if you ever feel any pain, if there's ever anything that feels off, tell them you feel more pain than you're actually feeling, so that people move a little bit quicker on your behalf. And as a mother, I was obviously afraid, but as a Black woman, it terrified me that a doctor, somebody who is supposed to care for me and my child in this moment, would not believe my symptoms, would not come to my aid when I said I needed help, because of the notion that Black women can handle more pain just based off of history. And it prompted me to make sure that wherever I went, that my doctor was Black. Why? Because having someone who has been in my position, who's been in my shoes, who knows what that feels like to be unseen, to be unheard, to not be believed. And when we talk about the rates of mortality in childbirth and how that's higher for Black women, I needed to make sure that there were people in the room with me who looked like me, so that if things went left, I had somebody in my corner. I needed to make sure that my husband had all of the information so that he could advocate for me on my behalf. They were also pushing for meds that I didn't need, and my husband had to say, she told you she didn't want it. And I think there aren't enough advocates for Black mothers. There aren't enough advocates for Black women in general. And I think employing Black doctors, employing Black pediatricians, and I think having Black people in healthcare, it's not just important for representation. It's almost it's essential for survival. It's essential for, and it shouldn't be. If they're doctors, they're doctors, right? But that's not the way that it's panned out. And I think that even now, having a daughter, that I have to make sure that if anybody were to come in for her to be her care in that moment, that I would want it to be somebody that had her best interests at heart. And to feel like a white doctor wouldn't have that, and that I would have to go out of my way to find something. And I had a conversation with somebody and they were like, but if they're the best and if they're white, why does it matter? I was like, because I need to make sure that I'm seen. I need to make sure that I'm heard. And I think it's that sense of home, and it's a sense of the community that you have, that I don't want to feel like I'm in this alone. Which is how I felt, especially with my first son's delivery, because I told them something's happening to my body, and they're like, you're fine, it'll be fine. And then having doctors scramble at the last minute because nobody was prepared. So I think making sure that Black women have all of the information and know how to advocate for themselves is super, super important.
To your point, my sister, when she was going into labor with my niece, she was a part of a clinic, and she was younger at the time, which should have no bearing on her motherhood or anything like that. I remember her calling me because she was in Brooklyn at the time, and I was here in Jersey, and I was getting ready to go and be a part of the delivery. I remember her calling me crying, just saying that she was so frustrated because she was being ignored by doctors. It did just everything. And to your point, my niece was delivered, but then there's like a team of like 20 pediatric people rushing into the room. So she also tried to advocate for herself and tried to speak up, and she was just rejected, like just treated like nothing. And her going through that experience, because I hadn't experienced that, thankfully, it made me change my approach and how I pick my doctor. So my dentist is in South Orange, she looks like me. I go to a holistic GYN, she looks like me. And I have to do that for my safety and for my comfort, because I don't want myself or anyone to be in that situation. And it's something that needs to be discussed. I'm not sure if it is because I'm not a doctor, but it's something that should be discussed in medical schools. It's something that should be discussed in undergrad. It's something that should be ongoing. Like, these conversations need to happen, and it's unfortunate, but these are true things that are happening. People, we are living our lives like this, so.
Thank you. So I do think we have time for 2 more questions. As we sit here, being co-hosted by Peace of Mind and the YMCA, compelled to ask, what role do community organizations play in addressing the trauma caused by racism, and how can individuals get involved?
I'll try to make it quick, but I do want to give some background. So I grew up in Summit. I'm sure most people are familiar with Summit, but town right next door, predominantly white. I think a bit more diverse than the Springfields and the Berkeley Heights, but still predominantly white. And I grew up in the city, had a teen center at the time, which is a big reason why I do what I do. And the teen center was really the only place in town where me and people who looked like me, which were my friend group at the time, could go and not be harassed and be ourselves, wear what we want to wear, have similarities in culture. Also, the staff there was predominantly Black. It was the first time where I had mentors and I had mentees and people of that older generation outside of my family who I could look up to, who could relate to me. I think we talked a little bit earlier about everybody growing up in these type of towns and having stories. I remember, being followed around by police officers and being able to just go to the teen center. I remember, Friday nights, a bunch of white kids would hang out in town. Me and my friends would get there, and all of a sudden police are called and we're asked to leave. And so I would always be able to just go there and have that safe space. Also, I got to learn a lot about my culture, my history, and these school systems, they go on Dr. King you and Harriet Tubman you to death in Black History Month. Watch an episode of Roots, and that's kind of it. But at these teen centers with these facilitators is what I learned about the Panthers and people who stood up for themselves and created their own. And I learned about the Madam C.J. Walkers, you know, the first woman millionaire, not black woman, the first woman millionaire. And I learned about the Moors and how they affected world history on a larger scale. And so I just learned so much. I got a lot of knowledge of self there. And again, it was a safe space to bond and be around people. So that's just my history with community organizations. I think community organizations, as I talked about, just doing things on the local level are super important. And the right community organization is gonna be there for the people. It's gonna be there to support, to be accessible and share resources for all. It's gonna be nonpartisan, so there's no political agenda to guide it. And I think just the possibilities for what it could be and should be, I almost can't describe how important it is to host a panel like this, to have these important conversations where you may not be able to have it, or just providing the resource, right? Like I think a lot of times organizations, people, everybody wants to be the one to lead the cause or put together this event, but the right place will be there to support other people or others, organizations in the community doing the work. So again, just from my standpoint, that's what it meant to me. And I think that's what all community organizations should do and should be.
Anyone else?
And to add on to what Trevor is saying, the YMCA has been that space for the last 12 years for me and my family. This is our second home. Having someone like Trevor do the things that he does, and he's gonna downplay it, but he has such a positive effect on the youth. He does a lot of great things, and he will be very shy about it, but he's definitely leadership, and he's definitely like setting the bar and really creating spaces for the next generation. And I can personally, you know, thank you for that, and I thank the Y for that, and I thank Tiffany. So many people like you are the reason why, you know, my kids, even myself, want to be here in this community. You know, I may have my adversities with, you know, situational things, but at the end of the day, I know that there's a safe space. I know that I have people like Chris, who's always looking out for the community as well, and always doing everything that she and her organization can do to support communities. And when you have that type of, you know, space, and you have that type of community, it makes it so much easier, and it makes it so much better, because again, it's having that voice, like you said, being able to be in this space and to talk freely and to feel, you know, and feel like, all right, you know, I'm okay. I don't have to worry about, okay, I'm gonna get some blowback for this. Is very important.
Really quick, what I have not been in spaces like this often, where you have community leaders that are willing to do the work, right? And I think two important things came to mind when you were talking, Trevor. I think it's important that we have difficult conversations, and for people that are not in Black and BIPOC communities, differentiate between feeling uncomfortable in a situation and feeling unsafe in a situation. We can have a difficult conversation. You are uncomfortable, you are not unsafe. So I think leaning into those crucial conversations is important. And I think the other thing is not putting it on, not putting it on Black and BIPOC communities to educate you about these issues. It's you doing the work, and you intentionally making the change. It's not, okay, like, you do this for us, you show us what you want to do. No, it's how can I do my part as a person with X amount of power, X amount of privilege? What can I do within that to help to dismantle these systems? Because I think the reality is these systems aren't broken. These systems are doing exactly what they've been designed to do since the beginning. So it's not fixing a broken system, it's dismantling a system that's gone on for far too long. And I think the big part about that is then what can these other communities who have voices that are heard more so than others, how can they be intentional about doing the work and not putting the responsibility back on these Black and BIPOC communities to do the work for them? And I think those two things are pretty crucial in making sustainable change. Yeah.
One thing I'll add about individual contributions is for individuals to consider volunteering with organizations that center Black and BIPOC communities, and to consider donating to those organizations. I think oftentimes, right, people listen and say, oh, make a donation. It's just like it's writing a check, and maybe that's the extent to which someone can advocate. But that level of advocacy also has a opportunity attached to it, and that's one of providing services and resources to people who are not financially able to do so because they don't have the generational wealth to tap into to get therapy, counseling, wellness services, and other services that are available. So it may seem like it is not that big of a deal, but it absolutely is. It literally could save someone's life. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up with our final question, which is what resources or tools would you recommend for individuals who want to educate themselves further about racism and its impact on marginalized communities?
If I can start.
You jumping. Go.
So I love reading, so I'm gonna say read a book. And I say that because, and that came out very bluntly, but I say that because, and to what you said, it's not our job to educate you. Of course, if you have an honest, genuine question, I don't mind answering questions. However, when so many of our Black leaders have written books about their lives, I mean, Malcolm X, it is a long read. It is a tough one. But, I mean, you have Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey's written books. If you really want to know about it, then you will. And I just say reading is so crucial. Education is a beautiful thing. And if you can go and just find an excerpt of a book, just if you don't, because some people truly don't know about slavery. I remember I went to the National African American Museum when it first opened. Me, my mom, my dad, whole family, uncle, aunt, and we were right in front of this white family that was walking, and we get to the slavery part, and she just starts crying because she had no idea it was this bad. And of course, I was taken aback. I said, "Wait a minute, what was your perception of what slavery was?" And she thought it was an apprenticeship program. And I said, "Okay," and it was to a point where some people don't know, unfortunately. The education system was sort of built for you not to know the full extent of these, of what happened, and it's unfortunate. However, it's a system that we have, and it was built that way, and it's working that way. And you just have to sort of maneuver the system. The books are there, and there's some people that, like, you can just listen. They have audiobooks. Like, I stress a book so much because all the information is right there. So I would say reading is the biggest thing any individual person can do to want to know more about what Black and brown communities are going through. If you want to know more, then you will. And Malcolm X is a great read. MLK has books, but of course we learn about them in school. Go find a person you've never heard of before, like Ulado Okwano. He was a slave from Nigeria that went to France, learned how to be a pastry chef and a writer at the same time. They don't teach you that in school. If you go find his autobiography, read it just to get an idea of what it really was. I think that's how someone can really start their journey on being educated and dismantling their inner biases and their inner racism, maybe.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I say just get outside. Like, I think it's easy for me to, as a person that deals with equity and hosts trainings and does workshops, I see the benefits of it. So I think that's a simple answer to do that. But I would just encourage people to stop living behind, social media or YouTube or TVs or computers, where the person on the other side may have biases or agenda, and just get around some people that have different perspectives than you. To your point, be open-minded, be humble enough to have these open conversations, and be okay to say, I don't understand something. Mm-hmm. To Morgan's point, it is extremely exhausting being the Black person that everybody goes to with questions. Mm-hmm. but also to your point, there's too much information for people to be, unfortunately, as ignorant as they are today. So just get outside, get around people, things like that.
The two recommendations that I have, Morgan just mentioned. One, the Blacksonian, right, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Take the weekend and go deep. It is absolutely worth it. It is life-changing, but it is absolutely worth the trip. I subscribe to a newsletter entitled Reimagined. It is authored by Nicole Cardoza. It is formerly Anti-Racism Daily. It really is phenomenal. There are facts every single day and a recap on the weekend. So keep that in mind. And I think just the third is, I mentioned it a moment ago about making the donations to organizations. So the Loveland Foundation is an incredible organization. They provide free and reduced fee, but mostly free, counseling services for Black women through the foundation. Rachel Cargill is the founder. Another phenomenal organization. So those would be my suggestions. But I'm 100% behind Morgan on this one. Get a book, read an article, go do it. And with that, we actually are going to wrap up the panel Q&A and open for questions from the floor. All right, great. Do we need to have a mic go back, or are we okay?
I don't think I need a microphone. I'll project. Stephanie, I want to thank you so much for hosting this panel. These critical conversations are very important as we drive change and navigate difficult times. I wanted to add another resource. I just have a comment that I wanted to say. Reading books is absolutely important. I agree with you, Morgan. One book that I want to offer to this group as we have these difficult conversations, Say the Right Thing: How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice. It's by Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow. I just attended a diversity workshop last week, and this is kind of my wheelhouse, and I started to read this book, and I think it's important for all of us to kind of dig into this because these conversations are critical, and we need to have the language and the terms to engage in meaningful conversations. So this is what it looks like. If you want to see it, I highly recommend it. Say the Right Thing by Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow. And I just want to thank you so much. This has been very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, I'm Sienna, Ayana's daughter. So not to talk too much, because I'm a talker just like her. No offense, Mom. I definitely, it's genetic. I definitely want to validate your feelings, Morgan. You know, being one of like 4 in the entire school. I could do a tell-all, but I won't because time. But one of my questions is, I know that you have children, and I'm assuming they're young, right? One of the things I struggled with, social studies, 8th grade, I can name the teacher, but I won't name names because we're recording. The Confederate flag was hung up. So imagine you're 13, you're coming after lunch, you know, you're and boom, the Confederate flag. One of my questions is, how can we instill diversity, equity into a day-to-day for children that age? Because at 13, at least for me, I'm worried about fitting in and, you know, looking good and boyfriend and this and that. So how, in a way, can we do better in the local school systems? How can we make that a day-to-day topic for children to talk about, or, you know, once a month assemblies? Like, how do you think we can move forward with that, especially having children that young, and then you working with teenagers, and then obviously it's a little different from you because you're in college, but like, how do you think we can move forward?
I think it starts with curriculum. I think it starts with what we're teaching, how we're teaching it. I know that so I started out as an English major, and there was this big, I want to say there is still this big push for Shakespeare being the one that we study. And I think shifting to also having different artists from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic statuses. The content that we're teaching, I did a study on hip-hop based pedagogy and how in these communities where hip-hop culture is a big part of the Black community, how is it that we can make learning engaging and relatable so that children are also a part, they're seeing themselves in what they're learning. So I think teachers also need to be able to think outside of the box, because I think there's a science to teaching and then there's an art to teaching, right? And I think it's important for children to see themselves in every part of the curriculum, every single part of the curriculum, because then we talk about how Black students aren't engaged, they don't want to learn anything. And I think for me, I didn't see myself in what was being taught. I didn't see teachers that looked like me. Even in the dance community, I learned a lot from dance teachers that weren't Black. And it wasn't until I had my first Black teacher that I was like, okay, I can see myself in this. So I think it has to start with changes in the curriculum. It has to start with how, and even before that, I would say it has to start in teacher training programs and how we're training teachers to teach. Because if we're starting with having conversations at staff meetings, we're already late. We've already missed the mark. Yeah, that's all I'm gonna say about that.
Yeah, I would say I agree with all that, and there's a lot I can add to this working with teens. I think obviously, challenging, our boards to make sure that they are looking for teachers and staff members that look like those students, right? There's no excuse for it. Nobody should be hired if they're not qualified, but there's no excuse anymore that you can't find somebody qualified from whatever demographic, right? So challenging that. I think when there's opportunities to support groups or help students create groups like Black student unions, you don't need to be a teacher, you don't need to be a student or even a parent to help support and help move the needle. Same thing with curriculum. Meeting with superintendents, meeting with teachers, making sure that curriculum is challenged. When there are teachers there too, this is another big one too. When sometimes in these school systems, there's maybe one or two Black teachers, it's a whole nother story in terms of what they have to do, being the only Black teacher, understanding what the students are going through while having to deal with everything else. So making sure those teachers are supported. So I think a lot of engagement can help that way. And Ayana and I were talking about this earlier. I think it is a village situation. I think all of us can play a part and just helping out. I know there was one group I was working with too, in terms of when there are incidents like the Confederate flag thing. Checking the school in terms of how are they dealing with it. Is there's still school systems that don't have proper HIB protocols. And then not only, okay, we had that conversation, but weeks later, a month later, did you really address the issue? So just being involved and making that effort to make sure that the kids are supported.
So go to the Board of Ed meetings.
Yeah, I think
Show up.
it definitely does start
I
there.
don't go here no more.
More reason to.
Can I just put a cap on response for that question? So I am recently transitioning from comms and PR to early childhood education. And I attended my first NJEA conference in Atlantic City last month. I now understand why teachers need to and educators need to spend 3 entire days going from session to session to get better at their craft and to spend time really thinking through what are some next practices in teaching and education. And for anyone who said like, well, what are teachers doing in Atlantic City all this time? Like, there's some real stuff that's going on down there, right? So my first session over the days that I was there was a session that was hosted, a workshop, a 4-hour workshop led by Goldie Muhammad, who is an author and educator and scholar, and she recently published a book titled Unearthing Joy, and it is a guide to culturally and historically responsive teaching and learning. When I tell you the session ended and I was in tears, she walked away from the microphone, turned around, and I was in her face like, this was it. This solidified my decision for making this move to education, because I want to be that person that's in the classroom with little brown and black children who look at me, and I am in a space just like that, sitting on the floor eye to eye with children who are smiling when I am attempting to speak to them in Spanish, when I am speaking to them in English and telling them, I see you, I hear you, I want you to calm down, I need you to talk to me, let's talk about what's going on with you. It is this book, I haven't read it yet, but my experience in that room with her and probably the 40 other people that were in there absolutely was like, yep, these are my people, this is my tribe, let's go, let's do this, let's make this all work. So I'll share the resource with Chris if you're, and I guess the others that we talked about as well, to share with people in the room and others, yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So I say this to all the white people in here. Be willing to walk into a room and be uncomfortable, in the sense that admit what's happened in history has happened and not try to make excuses for it. Be willing to ask questions if you're willing to hear the truth, but also be willing to learn yourself. And reading is fundamental. 3 really important books that helped me a lot: How to Be an Anti-Racist, White Fragility, and Me and White Supremacy. I suggest that whether you listen to an audiobook, whether you have the book on your bookshelf at home, we have a lot to learn.
Thank you for that. And,
Absolutely.
you know, it's important for me to say this. It's nice to be in a space like this where I can talk freely, because I don't always get to do that. I can't do that at work. I got to put a mask on and I have to go in there and do my job. So being able to have this opportunity to kind of just speak my mind and speak freely, and it be in a space where people are willing to hear and not judge or criticize, is very important. So I'm thankful for that.
Of course.
I just almost coming off of what you were saying, I was curious of how does everybody feel after talking and having people listen. Yeah, I'm curious of how everyone feels.
Feel lighter. Coming back home from college is always different because I go to an HBCU. Not saying there are not white people at my institution, because there are. And I have had white professors at my time at school, which is always an interesting experience in a black space, because even if you teach in a black space, you still have your implicit biases. The savior complex that you had mentioned is still very much there. So my guard is never fully down. But when I come back home, I live in Springfield, like I said, it is, again, that mask that you're talking about, and I do put that mask on. I don't go outside without making sure I look presentable. Even though I'm in my own home, I'm not going to school there anymore, it's just still that mask. So being able to just breathe and just say everything, and I just feel a lot lighter, because even at my school, a lot of people don't understand where I'm coming from. A lot of them grew up in Baltimore City, or they grew up in predominantly black spaces, whether the socioeconomic status was high or low, whereas I grew up in a white area. So it's still that, yeah, we're the majority, but then within our community, I'm still the minority. So they don't always understand, because this is their first time seeing white people in college, and they're like, it's a culture shock for them almost. They're like, wait a minute, like, this is different. So, whereas for me, it's reverse. I'm in a space where it's all of my people, so this is nice to let out still some of those racial traumas that I still had. And I'm gonna have to go to therapy, so I'm glad that you mentioned that resource because it is a lot going through K-12. So I'm glad we had this. This is really nice.
Yeah, I think this was a great conversation, and I don't know if we're wrapping up now, but I thank everybody for coming and again taking that step to listen and be open-minded. What I will say though is, whether it's a panel or even a protest, they're very crucial first steps, but it's just the first step. The more important steps are kind of what goes on after this. Like if you think about it, like if you're planning an event, the panel, the discussion, the protest, that's like the flyer, but you still got to put on the event. You still got to work towards it. So these conversations are always encouraging, but just being mindful that this is just the first step in many steps.
I think for me, like I said, this is the first time that I've been in a space like this, and I think it's really refreshing to be able to unearth a lot of these topics. But I will say that this space feels safe. But in all honesty, all I could think about was I'm gonna have to drive back home and what that's gonna look like and what that's gonna feel like. That I'm gonna have to drive through these towns to get home. And that it was a reminder that, like, as sacred as these spaces feel, that the work is not done and there is still an after. Like this is important, but there is still an outside world that still needs a lot of healing and just a lot of something. But this was a really refreshing time to be able to just sit and listen, and know that I'm also not alone in what's happening. So, and even just to have people that want to hear and that want to hear a different perspective and want to see kind of what some of our realities are, because just because somebody else doesn't experience something doesn't make it less real for somebody else. And I think that's super important for me to feel, because I think sometimes, especially because I work in corporate, sometimes it feels very, very lonely, very lonely. So this felt really nice. Yeah.
I feel like my community has grown.
Yeah.
I feel like my community here has grown. I feel like my community around the room has grown. So I feel I'm on sleep nice tonight. Thank you. Thank you for this.
Yep. Thank you, Chris.
So just really quickly, I want to thank the YMCA and the Diversity Council from Berkeley Heights. Ayana's on that as well. Angus is in the back. And these organizations, they do so much for the community. I mean, it's really unbelievable. So I know we're over time, but I would really highly encourage you to read about them, go on their websites, both the Y and Diversity Council as well. They really make a huge difference. And next month we'll be hosting bystander intervention. So it's going to be, how do you get involved when you see something, but you do it in a safe way? And that was a big training that I attended, and I made some mistakes personally that jeopardized my safety, and I thought I have to get trained in this myself. So it's a free training yet again, and we'll be sending out information. So thank you all so much. Thank you.